Get started, Jerry. Good evening, and thank you for giving your talk on the United States Navy in Erie over its history. I'm sure it's going to be a really interesting talk. Before you start, I'd like to give a little bit of a introduction to what's going on around here at the Hagen History Center. My name is Jeff Sherry. I'm the museum educator. Right now, we're only open Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from 11 to 5. We also offer at this time a driving tour of Erie County. When you come in, purchase your driving tour. It's $10 for non-members, $8 for members. You'll receive a brochure that highlights the sites on the tour and a book that has information about, it's a very nice hardcover book full of photographs that highlights sites around Erie's Bayfront called Home Port Erie, and that is the name of the driving tour. There it is, okay. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our speaker, and I'm gonna just give you a little brief rundown on Jerry Skrypzak. Jerry Skrypzak, I like to call our super volunteer here at the Hagen History Center. Jerry will come in at about any time. Jerry has his own personal photo collection, which is probably larger than many archives, many museums around the country. So if we need a photograph of something, or I have a question about Erie history, Jerry's my go-to guy. Jerry Skrypzak is a graduate of Gannon University. He is a retired Erie City police officer, photographer of note. He started the first photo lab for the Erie City Police Department that they had when he was working as a police officer. Crime scene investigator, crime lab, in charge of the crime lab for Erie, and author and co-author of many, many books on Erie history. And as I said, a very, very important photographer as far as his collections go. So I'm going to let Jerry get started. Tonight's topic is the United States Navy in Erie. Jerry?
Hi, Jeff.
How you doing, Jerry?
It's real quick. When Jeff asked me to speak tonight, we chose, because it was Veterans Day, we thought it'd be appropriate to do a military theme. Most of the time, I'm used to talking about our waterfront and the fishing industry and railroads and the history of downtown Erie and Mill Creek flood. I've got interest in a lot of those subjects, but this one is of particular interest to me. And you have to stop and look back into our history and realize that Erie and the military have been together almost since it was founded. If you take a ride by any cemetery, you'll see the rows and rows of little flags of all the veterans that served who were from our city. And I chose the Navy because mainly I could find a lot about it. I was always interested, and I chose the Navy mainly because over the years, we tend to look at one aspect of our involvement with the Navy, and that was the Brig Niagara. And we tend to have a focus, but we had an awful lot of other naval activity throughout the years in the city of Erie. The first thing we want to talk about is the fact that we wouldn't even be here, I think, if it wasn't for the Presque Isle Peninsula. It's a sand spit, 7 miles long, and it's 3,200 acres. And it's Pennsylvania's only seashore, but what's significant is it's a natural harbor. And that was one of the main reasons why we settled here. And the French came to a conclusion back in 1740 when they first discovered the peninsula, and they realized that it had a strategic value. First of all, it was a safe harbor. You could pull in there. But for them, it was part of a chain of forts that they built all along the Great Lakes. And one of them was a chain of forts that went between here and Waterford. And they had another one at Fort Michault in Franklin, Pennsylvania. And of course, they had Fort Duquesne. The purpose of these forts was to protect their fur trade. They were busy gathering furs throughout Canada, and they were using the Erie area to transfer them down into Pittsburgh and eventually down into the Mississippi River in New Orleans. They liked the area so well that they decided to build a fort here. and they established a village. There were 100 families that settled here, and they added a grist mill. And they planted crops, but when the French and Indian War started in 1760, they abandoned the fort and they let it go. To the British. The British liked the location, and they saw the strategic importance of Presque Isle, and they built another fort. Now, both the forts were built in the same location at the mouth of Mill Creek, which is about, if you take a tour into town and you go to the bottom of Sobieski and Front Street, which is located on Erie's east side, is approximately where those forts were built. And at that time, the Mill Creek was running above ground, and after the flood of 1915, the Mill Creek was put into a tube, and it still runs through town, but in a tube, and it exits the tube just about the other side of the Bayfront Parkway into the sewage plant. But again, like I said, they used the pathway that was developed from here to Waterford to along the French Creek to Fort Michault, and then to Fort Duquesne, and that was their road. And that same pathway was used in later years by other settlers. Now, back in after the French and Indian War, things kind of quieted down on the frontier. Erie was a frontier town, and we started to expand north into the other territories. And Pennsylvania realized that they didn't have a lake port, and they wanted one. So they purchased 200,000 acres of land called the Erie Triangle. It's a triangle land that parallels the New York's western boundary in New York State and runs from Corey all the way to the Ohio border. And that little land is called the Erie Triangle. And having that land made it part of Pennsylvania, gave us a natural harbor on Lake Erie. In 1795, again, seeing the strategic importance of Erie, the Americans came in and we built another fort. But this time we built it on a bluff overlooking the harbor, not down on the mouth of Mill Creek. And from there, they decided they had a better control of anything coming in out of the harbor. If they had to protect it, they could fire cannons, and it made an easier way to defend the harbor. Same time, we started getting settlers coming in Erie. The first families that came here were the Reed family. Colonel Seth Reed came in. Thomas Reese was here, and he was sent here by the state to survey the land. And then Daniel Dobbins came in. Now these people, when they settled here, they started things rolling. Every one of these names were responsible for important events that happened throughout our history, and their names will come up frequently throughout the talk. Now, one of the first things that they did when they moved here was to start building ships, because there was no Interstate 90. There was no other ways to get around. The trails that they had were Indian trails, rough. They weren't even suitable for wagons at that time. So the best way to travel would be along the water. So they built ships. And the first one that was built was built in 1798. It was not built in the city, but it was built at the mouth of 4 Mile Creek. And it was the sloop Washington. Interesting story about the Washington. It was used for several years in trade on the Great Lakes, and it was sold to some British or some Canadian concerns who bought the ship, and they actually portaged it around Niagara Falls onto Lake Ontario. In fact, about 4 years ago, it went down in a storm. About 4 years ago, they found a wreck, and it's at the bottom of Lake Ontario, still in one piece. There were other boats were built here. Captain William Lee, and again, Rufus Reed, the son of Seth Reed, built a boat called a Good Intent. And what they used these boats for primarily was the salt trade. And salt was a commodity back then that was necessary for preserving meat, but they also used it as a currency. So they built ships that took them up to Black Rock or Buffalo, Salinas, New York area. They brought their salt, carried it back, and then back and forth between, they carried the salt down to Pittsburgh, following the same route that the French did with their fur trade, again to Waterford, to French Creek, to Franklin, to the Allegheny River, to Pittsburgh. And that established a new trade route through Erie. all this was going on for several years, but what happened was things were getting a little tight between the United States and the British and Canada. The territories were expanding, and there were some disputes about borders in Oregon and in Maine, and the relationship was getting pretty bad. In fact, Captain Dobbins, we mentioned him earlier, Daniel Dobbins sailed up to the Mackinac Islands and was captured by the British, and they took his ship and they captured him, but he escaped. And he traveled down to Washington and met with President Hamilton and talked to him about what the British were up to. And this is then that Hamilton and Congress decided that we better do something to keep the British in place on the Great Lakes. So they commissioned a set of ships to be built in Erie, which is the famous fleet from the Battle of Lake Erie. There's a photograph of Dobbins. Like I said, he was also commissioned to build the ships. And in order to do that, Erie was a small town. There weren't more than a couple hundred people living here. There was just a few houses. Of course, we had a beautiful harbor, and there wasn't much going on. And they needed people to come here. So they hired 300 workers that came to Erie, carpenters, millwrights, blacksmiths, and they started building the ships here. And they basically doubled and nearly tripled the population of Erie. Now, they built the ships using materials that they got from Pittsburgh and from Buffalo. They carried up cannons, powder, nails, iron, anything that was needed necessary to build the ships. The lumber to build the ships is right here on the shore, so they didn't have to worry about that. And there were sawmills located on Mill Creek that they used to make the boards to build the ships. And then after the ships are being built, they built 3 ships at the mouth of Cascade Creek. That was the Lawrence, the Niagara, and the Ariel. And they built ships at the foot of what was Lee's Run, which actually runs pretty much alongside the building in where we're in now. It eventually became the path for the Erie Canal. But at the mouth of the creek at Lee's Run, which is about the foot of Sassafras Street, they built some of the gunships there. But in March of 1913, Perry was appointed to be the commander of the fleet. He came into Erie and started taking control and supervision of building the fleet. One of the advantages to our harbor was that the British were out on the lake, but they couldn't really see what was going on because they couldn't make it into our harbor. It was protected. I'll talk about it in a minute, but I'll point out to you where Perry had all his fortifications in order to protect the harbor while the ships were being built. Well, they were all completed. And then in September 10th, 1813, in July of 1813, they were able to have a window of opportunity in order to sail the fleet out of the harbor. There was a problem with the bigger ships, the Niagara and the Lawrence. They were too heavy, too deep of a draft to make it through the channels. So they built a set of pontoons called camels in order to raise the ships high enough. They took the armament off, they took anything that was heavy. They were able to carry those ships over the sandbars out into the lake. The British were not here, so they were able to escape, and they went up into the eastern part of the lake. And of course, on September 10th, 1813, the British and American fleet met up, and we prevailed and we won. And that's all we're going to talk about right now. But after the battle, tendencies to think that that was it. Well, that wasn't the case. Perry was sent with his task force up into Detroit to recapture Fort Detroit, which the British had taken, and to capture some territory there. At the same time, Perry also carried about 2,500 men onto Detroit, and these same men invaded Canada and basically left Great Lakes to Lake Erie to them. Now the Lawrence was shot up so badly that they took all of the wounded and sailors and put it onto it, made the Lawrence into a hospital ship. And eventually, when they were able to, they brought it back to Erie, and the sailors that were pretty well were hurt badly were put into a hospital that was built over in the peninsula. Now, this is just a slide that shows, if you can look on a screen, it shows where all of the installations or the fortifications for Perry were built. Now, there was a blockhouse built, of course, where the fort was at the top, above Mill Creek, where the Fort Prescott was. But they also built fortifications over at the mouth of Cascade Creek, and they built another fortification on a peninsula near Crystal Point. And they also had barracks in town, roughly where, say, 3rd and Sassafras Street is. And they had the hospital and storehouses over on a peninsula. Now, after the war, the ships that were not being used, the Niagara and the Lawrence and all of the captured ships were sunk in order to preserve them. I don't understand the reasoning, but they sunk the ships in Misery Bay and were able to eventually salvage a few of them, and they were sold. But having a Navy base, what does that mean? And if you ask any state that has military bases, they love them. They bring a lot of money, they bring a lot of jobs. I spent quite a bit of time in North Carolina, and there's Fort Bragg, and there's Camp Lejeune, and there's an Air Force base, all within probably 50 miles. And it's just boom for the territory. So having a base at your community is a big deal. I mean, they need housing, they need food, supplies, services. So it was a big deal for the time. In fact, it was a great boon to start Erie on its way to development, because we ended up with almost double the population. A lot of the carpenters and tradesmen that came here stayed, and a lot of them opened businesses. Now, after the Battle of Lake Erie, Perry was asked what they thought of the harbor, where it needed improvement. And in 1838, this map shows the breakwalls and channels that were built. One of the things first thing they did was to widen and deepen the channel coming to the bay, so you didn't need to lift the ships over a sandbar. They removed the sandbars. But in 1829, it was a problem because the peninsula broke at its neck. So what happened was Prescott was an island until 1880. And actually we had 2 entrances, one on both sides. But 1843, U.S. Navy came back to Erie. And the reason for that was the British were having some internal domestic problems. There was a rebellion going on. They were beefing up their fortifications. They even added a couple of warships onto the lakes. And of course, there were border disputes and things like that going on. And they decided that maybe we should have a stronger naval presence there. So a ship was commissioned, and it was the Uss Michigan. 1843, it was commissioned. It was a commission for the Secretary of Navy. Navy decided they wanted to build the first iron-hulled vessel in the United States Navy, because one of the reasons was iron was cheaper than wood, and believe it or not, and this was a surprise to me, an iron ship is lighter than a wooden ship, and the iron ship is more durable. So they had Stackhouse and Tomlinson Company in Pittsburgh build the ship. And in order to do that, they built an actual full-size model of the Michigan, as it was eventually called, of the ship in Pittsburgh. And they took the model in order to form the iron plates to the contours of the ship. They actually assembled it in Pittsburgh, unassembled it, and shipped it up to Erie via the Ohio Crosscut Canal. They brought it into Erie, where they assembled the ship again in the West Canal Basin. Now, people were all wagging their tongues thinking, it's iron, how can it float? And so the day that it was to be launched, pretty much everything shut down in Erie, and everybody went down to the harbor to see the newly built ship launched. Well, true to what they believed, it slid off the runners into the water and just sat on the bottom because the water level was low. Everybody laughed, went home, we told you so, and it wasn't going to work. But the next day, due to the winds, the water level in the West Slip went up. And when they came down to see the ship, it was gone. It had floated itself to the other side of the West Canal Basin, and they were able from that time bring it back, and they refitted it while it was there. It was actually launched on December 4th of 1843, and 2 days later, President John Tyler christened the ship the USS Michigan. Just a few things, you can look at the screen and see what it was like. But Michigan was a side wheeler. It had 2 steam engines. And officially the max speed was 12 miles an hour. But that was without full steam. And under full steam, they could get 13 miles an hour, which made it the fastest ship in the United States Navy for many years. Now, because of an agreement after the War of 1812, it's called the Rush-Bagot Agreement, it limited the amount of armament and amount of ships, warships it could have. So initially, the Michigan had 1 gun. It was an 8-inch gun, and it was the only thing it had for many years. But you gotta remember, the ship was around here for almost 80 years. And as technology changed and circumstances like the Civil War came up, they started adding a lot more armament to the ship. Inside the ship, again, as I said, there were 2 steam engines. And over the years, there were a lot of improvements added to the ship. They added improvements to the steam engines. They added electricity to the ship as it became available. And they also it was one of the first ships on the Great Lakes to be equipped with a wireless. And really, it was kind of silly because there were no other ships that had it, so they could just basically talk to themselves. And the thing about the Michigan, and if you notice on the screen it says Wolverine, and we'll talk to why that was changed later. These photos are taken when it was the Wolverine. But the Michigan primarily was a patrol vessel, but also it was out there for training too. So a lot of the sailors that came to Erie, I'll go back here first. First of all, the Michigan also had mast and rigging, but it didn't sail well because it didn't have a centerboard. And it drifted when it was turning, and under certain winds, it would not sail well. But the rigging was there mainly as a training prop for the sailors that were training on it. When it was first built, it was also painted black. And these are just a couple of different photos of it while it was in its black paint scheme. Now, it was a training vessel. There were thousands and thousands of sailors that came to Erie over this 80-year period, and a lot of them met Erie girls, and they married them. And for that reason, it was nicknamed the mother-in-law of the United States Navy. One of those officers who married an Erie girl was Charles Vernon Gridley. Now, Captain Gridley was well known for his involvement in the Spanish-American War. He was the captain of the Olympia, and in order at the Battle of Manila Bay, the orders he got from Admiral Dewey was, "You can fire when ready, Gridley," and that kind of stuck with him. Unfortunately, he died from complication of cancer while he was still out to sea in Japan, and his ashes were brought back to Erie and interred in Lakeside Cemetery. You can go there today. It's a nice site. There's actually 4 captured Spanish-American war cannons on the site. We honored him. We have a park that's off of West 6th and Liberty. It's called Gridley Park, and there's a Gridley School right across the street. Now, Captain Gridley married Harriet Vincent, the cousin of General Strong Vincent. Now, the Michigan here was here for 80 years. And during that period of time, it spent most of its time at the public dock. Now, the public steamboat landing, as we call it, was built in 1908. So prior to that time, it would be tied up to one of the parallel east or west arms of the dock. In fact, one of the photos I showed you earlier of the black color scheme was taken on the the wall of the west public dock. But most of the time later in the years, in fact, under the white paint scheme, at this time it was the Wolverine, and it was tied up. It was here all the time, and the crew actually lived on a ship the year round. When it was not out on patrol, which was most of the time, it spent the winters here, and the crew actually stayed on board the ship throughout the winter. It was even in the cold, they were able to keep themselves warm because of the boilers on the ship, and they had coal braziers. And another thing they built was a enclosure over the top of the deck on the main deck that added not only space, but it gave them some room for drilling, and they could keep themselves warmer with the cover on it. And according to some of the accounts that I read, a problem was the ship was warm, but there would be frost would form on the inside of the iron hull because there was no separation or insulation between the outside and the hull. So there would be a lot of frost would build up. The crew would normally in the wintertime were 1 day off, 1 day on. So a lot of them took jobs in town. They were skills that they were needed, and they took part-time jobs to supplement their income. They even had a band that would perform at parades and certain military events. They had a baseball team, and in the wintertime, they even did ice fishing and ice boating. One of the problems in the winter is they had to keep the ice away from the ship, so they would have to break the ice away so that the ice wouldn't crush the hull. A lot of the sailors, a lot of the officers lived at the Reed Mansion House, which is located at North Park and French. And then I guess there was another hotel on Lower State Street that some of them stayed at. A lot of them married local girls like it, and took up and bought houses in the city. And this is just a photo of the crew gathered underneath that enclosure that I mentioned. That was on the deck. And of course, you can see at that time there's even electric lights on it. They had other duties that they performed around the city. In fact, during the Mill Creek flood of 1915, they were called to do patrol duty in order to keep looters from the flood scene. They had a surgeon on board, and it was Dr. William Maxwell Wood. He had a long Navy career and served on a Wolverine from 1848 to 1861. However, from reading some of the literature on him, sometimes he was asked to consult at other naval bases on the Great Lakes, but he became the first Surgeon General of the United States Navy back in 1871. In fact, he was so well revered that there were 4 ships named after him. One that was sailed in the early 1930s, and then one that was used during the Second World War. And there were 2 others named in his honor, but the war ended and they never built them. But he had actually 2 destroyers named after him that actually made service. The thing about Max Dr. Wood was he brought his family, like a lot of the officers did, to live in Erie. And he had a home built within a matter of 100 feet of where I'm sitting right now. It's now called the Wood Morrison House. He built it in 1858. And he only stayed there a few years, and he sold the house in 1865 to Leverett and Missouri Morrison, the parents of Captain William Morrison, who would eventually become commander of the Wolverine. In 2018, the house was purchased and restored by the Erie County Historical Society, thanks to the generosity and vision of another Navy man, Captain Thomas P. Hagan, U.S. Navy Reserve. His foresight felt that this was a very, very important part of our history. In fact, he was born and raised right across the street from Wood Morrison House. The house is being used today as an education center and an exhibit area. And one of the exhibits in there is the Navy, Erie's naval history. You'll find a lot of artifacts and important parts of the Wolverine and a lot of his important artifacts of Captain Morrison on display. Captain Morrison was very active in local politics. He served 2 terms as a state representative, and he also was appointed the first superintendent of Presque Isle. Now, in 1912, the Wolverine was decommissioned from the Navy and turned over to the Pennsylvania Militia. And that's when Captain Morrison took command of the ship. He actually served in World War I, and he was promoted to lieutenant commander on the USS Utah. He moved back to Erie after his military service, and then, of course, took over on the Niagara. And the Pennsylvania Militia was actually started as a Pennsylvania Navy organized during the Revolutionary War. Later on, it was reconstituted as the Navy Force of Pennsylvania and was actually known as the Naval Militia. It was a predecessor to modern Naval Navy Reserve. In fact, we weren't the only state along the Great Lakes that had a Navy Reserve. The Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York all had a Navy Reserve. In fact, in 1915, the ships that you shown on the screen actually are sailing through the channel. They had a boat parade, and they actually had Navy maneuvers here. They practiced gunnery, they practiced Navy maneuvers and amphibious landings, and over 1,000 sailors came in for the practice maneuvers. Another thing is in 1905, the Secretary of the Navy, well, he was the president at the time, Teddy Roosevelt, had a Navy station built on the Great Lakes, and it's a training center. It's called the Navy Great Lakes Training Center for the U.S. Navy. Almost all of my friends that joined the Navy did their training at the Great Lakes Naval Air Station. It's still there. It's outside of Chicago. So that's just another presence of the Navy on the Great Lakes. Even though it's 1,000 miles in each direction in the oceans, that was still there. And up to the time of the Great Lakes Naval Station, most of the training officers were done on board ship while underway. In 1917 and 18, the crew from the Wolverine, or the Michigan at the time, was sent out to other parts of the Navy, and a ship was taken up to the Great Lakes to use as a training vessel. Now, just briefly, the history of the ship, it was launched in 1843. It had a lot of different activities that went on, that it intervened in. There were timber pirates that were working, stealing lumber from the lands up in federal lands up and around the Michigan Peninsula. It was used to guard Kelly's Island because Kelly's Island was a military prison for Confederate prisoners. That actually was a plot at one time by spies who were in Canada to commandeer the Michigan and to use it in order to release their prisoners and to attack the North from the Great Lakes. It was found out there were some spies that infiltrated, and they were executed. There were some other raids of other groups in Canada they intervened on. And in 1905, because Teddy Roosevelt was building his Great White Fleet, they called it, they took the name Michigan away from it. It was renamed the Wolverine, which is, of course, the state, the animal of Michigan. But it was decommissioned by the Navy in 1912, and it was turned over to the state militia. In 1923, on one of their training cruises, the port steam engine failed, and they limped back to Erie on one engine. And it just kind of sat in disrepair. The Navy wouldn't fix it, so they moved it off the dock because it was taking too much space, and they moved it over to Misery Bay. And eventually scrapped it in 1949. But if you read the log of some of the services, there were some fatalities on board. One of them was a sailor was drowned while participating in a water rescue. That was right out of almost within the first year it was built. In 1849, there was President Zachary Taylor was in here, and Vice President was coming in, so they decided to have a 21 gun salute. And of course, at that time, they only had one gun, so they had to keep firing it. Well, they didn't realize there was a spark still in there, and the gun exploded, and it killed two of the sailors on board. It actually got rammed during the Timber Wars by a steamer called the Buffalo. They could never prove that it was deliberate or not. The hull held up fine, but there was a lot of damage to the interior of it. It took almost 3 months to repair it. And in 1897, Teddy Roosevelt was actually Secretary of the Navy at the time, traveled on a ship to observe the maneuvers that were going on, similar to what we had in Erie. It patrolled the Great Lakes. These are just some photos of the vessel in and around the Great Lakes. There's one going through the Sioux Locks up in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. The photo on the right is at the ship at Port Dover, and it's interesting. The ship that's in front of it is the Canadian patrol vessel called the Valiant, and that was one of the ones that was being built that they were concerned about in order to build the Wolverine. And then the ship behind it is the Port Dover ferry. They used to run a daily run twice a day back and forth between Port Dover. There's another picture of Detroit River and Ashtabula Harbor. This is just a few pictures of the crew. Again, they changed. They were training here. They had a whole life to themselves. One of the things that was significant about Captain Morrison was he was commissioned in order to raise the Niagara out of its burial in Misery Bay. And on March 6, 1913, using crew and other contractors, they were able to raise the Niagara up onto the ice, and they put it over on shore. And that's what it looked like when they pulled it out of Misery Bay. Now, over the years, this is 100 years later, over the years, people used to dive down and steal parts of it. In fact, we have a lot of artifacts where people made gavels and canes and other pieces of the Niagara here at the museum. But in June 7th, 1913, it was relaunched. It was brought over to the other side of the bay, was towed over, it was outfitted, and getting it ready for the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Lake Erie on September 10th, 1913 was the 100th anniversary. What happened was when this anniversary came up, it brought a lot of people. And these are two photos taken here in Erie at the beginning of the celebration. And there's just thousands of people made it down to the foot of State Street. And at that time, there weren't many cars. There were trolleys that ran down. And it was quite an event. In fact, it was an event that was repeated throughout the Great Lakes. And the Wolverine was engaged to tow the Niagara throughout the Great Lakes ports. And that was one of its last duties before they quit using it. Now, it was towed over to Misery Bay after the rod broke. For many years, there was a gangway where people could just go and wander around. In fact, the picture on the right is a picture of my mom in a flower dress. And I think that little boy is me with the long curly hair. And those are some friends of ours from Pittsburgh and their son. In 1949, after 105 years of service, one way or the other, it was towed over to the city side of the shore and it was cut up. But an interesting story, that old lady would not give up. It was being towed by a fish tug. And as the fish tug slowed down, the momentum of the Wolverine sped up, hit the back of the tug and sunk it. And the sailors that were on board the Wolverine rescued the sailors from the fish tug. The interesting part of that ship was that it could have been saved. Nobody really wanted to do it. They pumped the water out of it and it floated. There were no leaks in the hull after 100 years. All that had gone was the wooden superstructure, the decks and the wheelhouse. And it could have been restored, but even though it was turned over to a couple of different commissions over the years, the city didn't want any part of it. And I think it's a black mark on our history. The prow was salvaged. The company that cut the ship up decided they'd save the prow. And then for years it sat over on State Street, a place called Wolverine Park. But after the Maritime Museum was built, a lot of the artifacts from the Wolverine are on display there now. The prow is still there. And we have a lot of the same, because for instance, the eagles that you see in a picture, there was one on each side. We have one here and it's in our new exhibit. We have the gangway planks and some other things. There's a lot of artifacts here from the Wolverine. Hopefully when this COVID is over, we can start getting back to full operations. We also had what was called the Marine Hospital. Initially, the Soldiers and Sailors Home was called the Marine Hospital. And it was primarily built to take and treat sailors and soldiers from the Civil War. And today it's called the Soldiers and Sailors Home. We even had a ship, a gunboat, named after the city of Erie. There were two Erie vessels named Erie. One was for Lake Erie, and a gunboat was built in 1936. And it was built in Brooklyn Navy Yard. It was a class, someplace between a destroyer and a cruiser. It was kind of a class by itself. It shown on the photo here is Mrs. Edmund Knoll from Erie, and the officer with her is her son, who was a Lieutenant Dennis Knoll at the time, eventually became a Rear Admiral in the Navy. The ship made its first shakedown cruise in 1936, and it helped out evacuating our citizens in the Spanish Civil War. In 1938, it came back to this side of the ocean, and then it was dispatched down to guide the Panama Canal during World War II. But on November 10th, 1942, it was torpedoed by a German submarine, and 7 sailors were killed, and the ship caught fire. The fires were extinguished, and an attempt was made to tow it back to a port to be repaired. And unfortunately, it started to list, and counter flooding didn't work, and it rolled over and capsized, and that was the end of it. But we actually had a United States Navy ship named after Erie. When World War II started, many of our industries in Erie were put to work for the war effort. And one of them that's kind of forgotten, it was for the Erie Concrete and Steel Company. They had an operation at the foot of, Cranberry Street. If you go look today, the whole dock is covered with condominiums, but they built 33 Navy vessels here. They were anywhere between 100 and 200 feet long. They were classified as yard ferries. They had a lot of utility purposes, mostly transporting supplies. They even built a couple of them that were floating magazines so that they didn't have to store a lot of munitions in port. They could have the magazines stored away from the rest of the facilities. They had derrick planes to lift seaplanes out of the water, but there were 33 different vessels built here. A couple examples. This is a lighter. There was an LCM built here. I don't know why they didn't build more. But just to mention, a couple of the ships were here. I do a lot of research onto the history of shipbuilding out of Erie. And in the master folder of registered Coast Guard vessels, there were at least 2 or 3 of them that were built in Erie, and after the Second World War went into other service, and a lot of them up in Alaska for service. But an example of that is if you go down to our harbor front, you'll see a ship called the JS St. John. That at one time was a small Navy ship. It was converted to become a sandsucker. Also during the Second World War, a lot of our fish tugs were commandeered and used as patrol boats throughout the Great Lakes. One of them was the My Toy, was this, and this was the Maverick H, which was a fish tug. It was converted to a fireboat and did operations in protecting the Cleveland at the Cuyahoga River. We had a lot of our shops, like I mentioned. Erie Forge and Steel was a big producer of drive shafts for the Navy ships. These huge 30 and 40 foot long steel shafts are made there. And today, I guess there's still some made there today. And we also, was a Skinner Engine Company who would build marine steam engines. After the war, during the war, I should say, the government confiscated the lake carriers. They were concerned about the possibility of having some labor problems, and so they took over the operation of all the ships. And after the war, they brought them back to Erie for disposition. There were 25 of them out in our harbor at one time. Some were scrapped, some were resold and repurposed throughout the world. Can't really talk about involvement of the Navy without really even thinking about the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard was established in 1850. We were one of the first places to get it came in as a U.S. life-saving service, and it later became the Coast Guard. But during the Second World War, the Coast Guard did a lot of their training here in Erie. They built barracks, and they had, for 200 men, they had a full-service training center. One of the things they had, this is an aerial view of 1943 of the gun range that they had on a peninsula. There's some remnants still there. If you walk back off of Beach 11, you can find some remnants back there. We even had the Coast Guard, a lot of the Coast Guard cutters, before they expanded the station, was here. And in fact, the one on the lower right-hand corner was a former subchaser during the Second World War. Now, in 1959, in order to celebrate the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway, a fleet of Navy ships came here, and they had a mock invasion on July 22nd, 1959. There were 2 destroyers and 2 subs in this photo: the Kennedy, the Ware, the Sablefish, and the Torsk. These are just another view of the subs from the bow and stern. There was the Oglethorpe, which was a let me see, let me get my notes here. Okay, the Oglethorpe was a cargo ship. Suffolk County was an LST. The Warrington was a destroyer. Terrebonne Parish was an LST, or a cargo ship. There were headlines. It was a big attraction for a lot of visitors. This is the list of the ships that were here. There were actually one was on there twice. So there's 13 ships or 12 ships and 1,400 Marines and 4,000 sailors. Now this is 1959 and I was a senior in high school. And a big deal that we used to do when we were kids was to ride up and down State Street called Buggin State. Well, when they were here, the girls wouldn't even look at us because they were all interested in all the different Navy personnel wandered up and down State Street those days. So we were kind of mad. But throughout the summers, over the years, we have had we call Great Lakes cruises, where the ships would come into Erie and would, in a purpose of doing recruitment services with the Navy, and a lot of the Navy reservists would sail. And this is one of the first that I was noticed was the Robert Owens and the William Law. I toured both of those ships when they were in Erie. They were a big attraction. Thousands and thousands of people would come down to our waterfront to see them. This is another ship that Daniel DeJoy was in Erie instead of the public dock. This is a minesweeper, the Hollidaysburg. It's a wooden ship. It had to be because it couldn't set the mines off. That was at our dock for a while. This is a Whitehall. It was a destroyer escort. This is a Canadian destroyer for the Perry Sesquicentennial in 1963. This was the HCMS Her Majesty Canadian Majesty ship, the Nootka. It actually visited us for that celebration. This is an LST, the DeSoto County. I'm not sure what the number of this ship is. I took that picture many years ago, but again, you can see they brought it in for a training cruise. We even had a Liberty ship coming through back here, John Brown. It was funny. I had my boat and I was trying to keep up with it as it was going out to channel. You know, I could barely keep, that ship was fast. I could barely keep up with it, my small 18-foot boat. And we had a string of guided missile frigates. They were called the Perry class, and they're named after Oliver Hazard Perry. And the Commodore Perry, or the Oliver Hazard Perry, was the name of the number 7, which was the first ship built in the fleet. It came into Erie Harbor, and one of my high school chums, Dave Mattis, was the executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Mattis on board. And a Perry was a guided missile, Perry class guided missile frigate. It was built in Bath Iron Works, Maine. It was launched September 1976 and commissioned December 1977. It only served 19 years of active duty. Since then, they've developed some better technology, but they built a whole fleet of these guided missile frigates, and a lot of them came to Erie. One of them was the USS Antrim, number 20. The Estosin, number 15. The Stark, number 31. And this is the Farian, but this is really a cool picture. This was taken by a friend of mine, and it shows the flagship Niagara with the Perry class USS Farian guided missile frigate in the background. I think that's really a neat picture. Over the years, this is all I was able to find. There may be more, but we have one current admiral, and I left it off here. I'll be darned. We had Vice Admiral Thomas Wechsler, and we have Vice Admiral Kohler, whose mother just died. I saw his name in a paper, but he's still on active duty. I somehow left it off the list. I apologize. And Rear Admiral Charles Kersey, who was a big benefactor of many of our exhibits here at the museum, and Admiral Dennis Knoll, Rear Admiral John Johansson, and Rear Admiral Stephen Jones. So we're all Erie natives who went on to the Navy to better things. If there were more, I apologize. I couldn't locate any more. But that's about all I have to say about the involvement of the Navy in the U.S. In the history of Erie, Pennsylvania. May you have fair winds and following seas is their wish that they pass on to everybody. I do that to you. Do you have any questions?
Jerry, thank you. That was fantastic. Really was. I'd like to say a couple things. Great point about the peninsula being the only reason Erie is here. That's something I taught geography for a long time, and I would say that all the time. There's no reason for Erie to be here were it not for Presque Isle. I was wondering about the 1829 when the west entrance, when Presque Isle became an island. Was the west entrance navigable?
Only for real small boats, Jeff. It was very shallow at that end, like it still is today. It took quite a few years. In fact, there'd been a lot of discussion about leaving it open to keep the bay fleshed out. I have some drawings that I bought of a proposed channel that the Corps of Engineers going to construct break walls and everything else. But one of the problems with those channels is something they experience. We experienced at Elk Creek. The littoral drift of sand down the west, down the south shore of the lake. If it just carries sand, so they'd be constantly dredging that to keep it open. When they did the channel on the east end of the bay, it's designed to be self-flushing, and they don't have to dredge it as often. Whereas, like at Walnut Creek, is a fishing site where a boat launch there, they have to dredge it every year. And I think that was one of the things that they were facing.
I see. That's great, though. I mean, to think about, what is Presque Isle in French? Almost an island. So you think about it. At one time, it was. Yeah. Right. And Vice President Teddy Roosevelt, when he was aboard Michigan, was it in Erie?
No, it was in the Upper Lakes.
Okay.
Boarded, I think, in Detroit.
Well, Jerry, I'm not getting any other questions from anyone, so I'm going to say thank you very much.
Maybe nobody was there. You
can't
think
tell.
I hate this venue because usually if I have an audience, I could throw an eraser at something to wake them up. I can't even do that.
I have pretty good idea. People were watching. But I want to thank you again from all of our viewers and from us here at the Hagen History Center for taking the time to prepare your talk and to come here and do it for us. Thank you very much. In December, our next speaker is Michael DeSanctis from Gannett University, who will do a talk about the creation of Christmas creches, which are nativity scenes. He did his talk here for a social group one time last year, and it was extremely interesting. So I hope you'll join us on Wednesday, December 9th for Dr. Michael DeSanctis. Again, that concludes tonight's talk from Jerry Skrypzak and from the Hagen History Center. I'm Jeff Sherry, museum educator. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jerry.
Welcome, Jeff.